On the road to Dublin International Airport, there was an old-fashioned inn, whitewashed on the outside and a lamp burning to the right of the heavy door. It looked like something out of a dream, or the 18th century, depending on your perspective and or knowledge of Irish history. Kathleen was an American, one of those with Irish heritage, from a family that faithfully wore green on St. Patrick's Day, but knew nothing of the Troubles or the famine, or why their family had emigrated in the first place. But that was a long time ago. When Kathleen first saw Malachy's Inn, there on the Dublin road, she decided to stop and take a photograph, see if they'd give her breakfast, and let her take a moment, hopefully before a fireplace, before heading back into her life. A charming anecdote or two wouldn't go amiss. It looked like that sort of place, because the trip up until now had been a complete wash-up. She'd woken up at dawn, determined to leave that miserable little bed and breakfast over the border, with its flocked wallpaper, strange-tasting milk, burgundy threadbare carpets and bad coffee. This entire experience was not what she'd expected at all. She had flown from New York to Ireland for a wedding, but now she realized she'd seen the wedding invitation as a sign. Kathleen was a sucker for signs, and she'd grabbed it as an excuse to get out of her life. The wedding was beautiful, but she barely recognized anyone. Most people had children under 6, who ran screaming everywhere. Labradors slumped depressed by the grand fireplace. Fiery burning torches lit the gravel driveway where she scraped her hire car, trying to park in the near darkness by the flint wall. But there was one really touching moment. When Kathleen went to retrieve her coat from the uniformed attendant, the bride suddenly appeared from behind a long red velvet drape. They both stood there looking at each other, in the coat check adjacent to the billowy tented ballroom, spread out over the manor house grounds. Swaying, lost in her own bliss, the bride tried to place Kathleen, but could not. That she smiled prettily but vacantly before returning to her guests. Kathleen peered back into the ballroom to see if she recognized anyone to say goodbye to, but then a bridesmaid just passed out, face first, into her soup, and she left. Driving back down the gravel driveway, she noticed a decadent lane of writhing couples pressed back into the yew trees, watched by a growing crowd of small children, their eyes open wide and mouths in little red O's. In the freezing cold bathroom back at the bed and breakfast, Kathleen ran a bath, but the water barely reached her knees and it was tepid. She climbed between the icy sheets and could not sleep. There was a bookcase next to the bed. She reached for her glasses and peered at the selection. Mostly Book of the Month Club collections from the 1950s and a few Irish folklore tales by Yeats. She read the tale about Smallhead, marvelling at its similarity to the Cinderella story. Although wicked stepsisters are a feature of many cultures, she remembered that from her Master's in Psychology thesis at NYU. Pulling the rental car into the gravel driveway, Kathleen parked out front. Even though it was still early, she checked her watch. 7 a.m. Malachy's Inn looked open and somehow inviting. She rang the bell, but no one came, so she tried the door. It was open. Of course it was open, thought Kathleen, who had lived in New York for so long that the idea of living without double bolts and a chain was astonishing. She stepped into the hallway, pulling the heavy door closed behind her to keep out the cold. There was a crackle of eggs hitting hot fat, and the most delicious wafting smell of bacon and sausages and toast. A fire burned greatly in the grate, and several old, barely sprung couches gathered around the room in small groups, ready for a person stretched out with a novel.
You can then. I was wondering if you would.
A woman spoke to her from behind the hatch that separated the kitchen from the main room.
You'll want your breakfast.
She said it as a statement, not a question. Kathleen wondered if she looked like someone who was expected for breakfast, someone for whom the toast, now nicely browned, cut into thick buttery slices, was being prepared. She knew her American accent would give her away as a stranger, so she stayed silent. In her heart, she wanted to be the one expected. She picked up the heavy silver knife and fork cautiously and looked at her watch again. How much time does she have?
You've plenty of time.
The woman wiped her hands on a side of the old, worn tablecloth and pulled up a chair. She poured a large cup of tea, added milk, and a couple of spoonfuls of sugar. A grandfather clock in the hallway ticked in a low, gentle tone. Kathleen sipped the strong hot tea and felt her shoulders drop and the crick in her neck ease.
I'm Maeve.
Of course that was her name, thought Kathleen. What else would it be in an old inn on the road to Dublin? She rubbed her eyes and tried to focus. It was becoming increasingly difficult to do so. So she asked the woman what had brought her to this inn. A smile played around Maeve's lips, and Kathleen felt intrusive asking such a question. But Maeve didn't seem put out. In fact, almost exactly as Kathleen would have written it if this were a short story. Maeve looked up at the sky outside, which was a pale blue with wisps of clouds blown gently across the heavens by the cold, biting wind.
I came for love, of course. The only reason in the world to go anywhere, move somewhere, do great and foolish things.
A telephone rang somewhere deep in the house, and Maeve went off to answer it. Kathleen moved over to the fireplace. A huge, soft armchair covered in dark brown velvet enveloped her, and she fell into a sleep, half dreaming, half awake. She ran her fingers through her hair to let the warm air from the fire tenderly caress her scalp, and then her fingertips caught on the pearl earrings. The earrings were new. She had bought them early yesterday morning when she went looking for a hair salon that could give her a wash and blow dry. The bed and breakfast had a hairdryer, but it would have taken all day to dry her thick hair with that sad little machine, and she craved touch. It had been many months now since anyone had touched her. When walking back to her car, she saw the small couturier shop with a little bell on the door and frothy white tulle covering much of the double-fronted window display. The owner stood in the doorway, chic in an elegant black button dress to her throat and proper black patent court shoes, with proper old-fashioned stockings with seams disappearing up the back of her long legs. There was such a ceremony in the purchase of the earrings. The owner brought out several pairs on a blood-red velvet cushion and motioned for her to sit on the dainty love seat upholstered in ivory satin. Kathleen felt for the tiny pearl earrings now and smiled. She half wondered when the grandfather clock here would strike, so she would know the time without having to move from this dreamy spot. Without a care in the world, she fell back into a soft slumber of grace and peace and magical happenings. When she woke up, she was no longer on the sofa, but in a four-poster bed, snug beneath a flower-strewn comforter, her hair spread out on the cotton pillows. Kathleen opened her eyes wide and looked around. She knew she should feel scared. How did she get up here? What was happening? But the deep slumber had given her strength. And then she realized she had missed her flight. There was no going back. She had decided that. In the moment between waking up and registering her new surroundings and feeling for her watch on the small side table, Kathleen knew her life had changed. Time had stopped. She was actually between times, although she did not know yet what that meant. Maeve stretched her arms wide and sat up in the window seat. Kathleen hadn't noticed her there. It was dark outside. Maeve got up and pulled the thick curtains across, shutting out the night. Kathleen could hear voices downstairs now, and the clinking of glasses, and laughter. She asked her what time it was. Maeve shrugged and showed that there was no watch on her slim white wrist. Kathleen felt delighted by a place with no time. Where she came from, time was money. Clearly this was not the case in Malachy's inn. She slipped back down the covers again and closed her eyes tight. Was she still dreaming? There was the sound of a bath being run, and Kathleen hoped it was for her. At the other end of her room was a fire, and it crackled in the grate as the logs disintegrated into the embers. She looked around and saw a small bookshelf with a solitary fabric-covered hardback book and a glass-fronted cabinet, but that was totally empty. Maeve came back with 2 fluffy white towels in her arms. She placed them carefully on the bed and pointed to Kathleen's clothes, neatly folded on a chair.
When you've had your bath, come downstairs. They want to meet you. We have something to discuss.
In the bathroom, Kathleen considered her fate. Had she been kidnapped? Was this a cult of Irish people who were nice and fed you and ran baths and made endless pots of tea? If so, she would stay. She had nothing to go back for and nowhere to move on to. She went downstairs. The bar was full of old men, some older than any man Kathleen had ever seen. They were smoking and drinking frothy pints of black liquid that Kathleen guessed was Guinness from the commercials she remembered seeing about Ireland. The old men nodded solemnly at her and turned back to their games of dominoes or intense conversations at the bar. The room behind, where she had eaten her breakfast that morning, was full of people in vivid colours with shiny apple-red cheeks, talking and laughing and holding their stomachs as they doubled over in delight at each other's tales. Kathleen could not see Maeve anywhere. She felt self-conscious and entirely out of place. It had occurred to her to check on her hire car, the one that she would have to pay a large fine for now as it was late, and then she remembered it was also damaged. Now she felt stupid for wanting to have an adventure. Why didn't she just get in the car, leave this strange place, and try to get a standby flight back to America?
You leaving already?
Kathleen jumped out of her skin. There was a man standing next to her who seemed to be about 90 years old. He was all crinkly about the eyes, and the eyes themselves were as green as the surrounding fields. Everyone stopped talking, and the people from the next room came back into this bar. They all looked at her with the same beautiful eyes. Kathleen wondered if she had died, and this is what happened to people from America who had Irish ancestry. After all those years of talking about the Emerald Isle, the universe's joke was to send them all to a forever Ireland.
We need a new shanky.
It was said as if she would know exactly what that was, and yet she found she did know. She had read about this on the plane on the way over. It was an ancient word for storyteller.
We've run out of stories.
Kathleen looked around the shelves in the bar and the room beyond, and recalled the bookcase upstairs and the glass-fronted cabinet. They were all empty. There was just that one book near the bed upstairs. What was that book? She looked at Maeve and tried to grasp what they were telling her. Were they a strange cult of writers? What was going on here? Then the man with the green eyes took her hands and told her that the book upstairs was his, or rather it was his story, but he was about to leave for the next world.
Do you have anything worth going back to?
There was a silence, and then one of the women from the next room standing in the doorway said, "Tell us about the new world." Kathleen thought for a moment and then looked around at the men and women in the bar. They looked so much like her grandfather's friends at the Irish Historical Society, so she told them about him being honoured and the fiddles and the Irish dancing and the singing late into the night. The room got brighter and brighter, and Kathleen felt her heart swell and her blood sing in her veins. She had never felt so alive. The people gathered around and their faces shone, hanging on her words. That had never happened before. Well, not for many years, although a little flicker and memory started to come back of running around Europe with friends and telling stories about growing up on the East Coast and the tales her grandfather would tell her. Suddenly she missed him so very badly. He always had a good story to tell. Sometimes a fairy story, other times an anecdote from his own childhood in Ireland, told when no one else was listening. There was a book on the top shelf. Kathleen had not noticed it before. Maeve saw her look over and smiled gently.
Keep talking. Keep telling us stories and the books will arrive, just like they did in your great-great-grandfather's day. It's been many years, Malachy, but one of them finally came home, and she's a real Shanky, all right. You can be proud.
Kathleen told stories long into the night and the next day, and through telling those back in New York that she was not coming back. Not for a long while, maybe not ever. She had a job to do now. There were stories to tell.